Hi, we're here in Zuni, New Mexico, and mostly because my friend Ray Amadon here has been talking about this place for, I don't know, 43 years or something like that. And it is a very special place, and I want Reed to tell us a little bit about it. We've had some other conversations and videos made that you'll see if you follow the sequence here with strange illuminations, and we'll hope you enjoy them. But Reed, what's the deal about Zuni?
Well, Zuni as a Zuni place has probably been inhabited literally for about 4,000 years at least.
Okay.
But I think that there have been people in the area that are probably related, which are called the basket maker people. And before them, even there are people that were here for 12,000. There's been people in this area for at least 12,000
Is
years.
it the oldest place on the North American continent for
No.
the length of people, or
No.
no?
No, it's not. It's pretty unusual that you had one pueblo that almost all that time has been populated, but there's another one, Acoma, Enchanted Mesa, is the longest pueblo that's been populated for all that time.
Pueblo meaning like I would think of town.
Well, a pueblo means kind of like a city.
Yeah.
And that's the pueblos. The Zuni people lived close together for a lot of reasons, but they farmed and they fished and they hunted and they did everything within the area, and then traded with other communities. So it was a very vibrant kind of situation.
Well, earlier you were pointing out this mesa.
Well, it's a sacred mesa, and I'm sorry I don't know the name of it, but many of their kivas, many of their organizations, sacred organizations, have caves or have sacred sites up here. When the Spanish came through, after Coronado came, he made first contact with the Zunis before he saw any other pueblo.
Really?
Yeah. And he almost was killed here fighting Fokia, but he ended up conquering that city, and they were there for a little while, and then they moved through, and Zuni, said that we're not going to make war on them. We're going to work with people diplomatically. But when the Spanish went through, the Zunis themselves went to the top of that mesa and stayed up there about 10 years.
Really?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It's a huge mesa. It goes way back there. I've never been to the top. I was offered the chance to do it, but I'm not nuts. I couldn't. The way he was pointing to was like straight up and then back.
How many people do you think were up there at that time?
I've probably a couple of thousand at least.
Okay. But one of the things that makes Zuni kind of qualify for our strangeness illumination for me is their religion involving the Chinas.
Well,
And
that doesn't
we'll get
make
into
me read. All the pueblos had it, but the Spanish stomped it out of most of the others. Now it's just pretty much Acoma and Zuni and Hopi.
But it is alive and being
very much alive
very much
well.
today.
Yeah, very much alive.
Okay, well, we're actually here also to visit with Kenny Bowekaty, I believe. I hope I pronounced his name right. He'll correct me when he gets here. Who works here on the reservation, involved with the development of the reservation here in Zuni. And so we'll wait. We did a little conversation with Reed out by the ovens and the sign earlier, just, why, it is Zuni, special, to him and all. And
okay.
Then we kind of ended that with, well, we're actually here to meet Kenny. Is it Bowekaty?
Yeah, you can use that close enough.
What's a good pronunciation?
Well, originally it's pronounced Bowekaty.
Bowekaty?
Bowekaty.
Bowekaty.
Yeah, Bowekaty.
Well, we have that on tape, so people will be able to know the correct pronunciation, but I'm just going to call you Kenny because
that works for me.
anyway.
Works for me.
we were last Tuesday. You gave us a wonderful tour of the church that is here,
Yeah.
and we cannot film inside. We can't take pictures inside.
No, it is a copyright. So.
But during that time, you really talked to us about a very special and seemingly unique culture here that involved, including the religion and how it came about. And I really kind of wanted to review some of that, and then and also I think there's a picture of the church over here, but mainly, you've got quite a history here as archaeologists, and all. And I start with a little bit of your background.
My of course, my background is a bit different than many people, say my peers of the community. Many of my peers, of course, were raised here in Zuni. And, for me, I was raised in a farming village, 15 miles south of Zuni, and just raised by my grandparents there. Uh, I was given teachings of, heritage, tradition, and a little bit of history, as it pertained to me being out in areas like this, Hawiku, about 300 yards south of this, was an ancient trade center, is the origins village of my grandfather.
Wow.
And this is where,
Not that long ago,
I was born in 1971, and from the get-go, of course, I was placed under the wing of my mother's parents, and this is where they, of course, didn't habitate here in Zuni. They lived in this farming village now known as Ohu Caliente. This area, of course, was an area that had spawned up as one of the premier farming villages. That was a seasonal type of habitation where, people came and went springtime, summertime, fall time, harvest time, and then majority of those people would come back to Zuni and reside in what are family homes. But we were the permanent, we were the permanent inhabitants there. My grandfather and my grandmother, of course, living here in this village. Winter times they spent up in the village, and of course during the springtime, we about 100 yards towards what is Hawiku is where we will raise sheep. This is an industry that we got into. Of course, that begins in the 1600s. This village, of course, was sort of my playground, and that's kind of where I got the interest of looking at pottery shards.
That's pretty interesting. Okay, you got an ancient village as your playground as a kid.
Yeah, and
I didn't have that.
yeah, ironically, this village was excavated, 50 years or 60 years before I was born.
Huh.
But the time when I was out there, the 70s and 80s, this village still, to some degree, had the temperatures that were just kind of left as is in 1923. And so partially, some of these rooms actually were partially filled by sediments due to weather, activity. And so, I got an opportunity to see more or less the midsection layout of this village.
Yeah.
And then, but this is where my great grandmother, she was very old, but she lived in the village as well. And this is where she was a pottery maker for as old as she was, 90s. I wouldn't, it had to be at least 90 something. But she was old and she still liked to make pottery. And this is where, we as Ashi are known to recycle what are the pottery shards that, of course, the vessel breaks. Those shards that, of course, created by this vessel will be recycled. And this is where my great grandmother would always ask me if I'm going to be, watching the sheep as a shepherd in these areas, because this is where I would come to. Because Howie could have seen me sitting right in this open field where you can see a nice view at least 50, 60 feet above this mound. And this is where she would ask me if I'm out there to bring her some pottery shards, 2 pocket pools. And that's kind of where, and then of course my grandmother, who of course was raising me, she would, um, often wash my clothes. And one day she found a pottery piece in my pocket. And of course, as I walked in this was at the farming field, and walked in the house, and she had this shard on the table. And it's just kind of just more or less telling me, I found this pottery shard in your pocket. And I said, oh, and this was all in Zuni, we told her that I was picking up pottery shards for grandma, which was her mother. And this is where I kind of probably asked that first real archaeological question of, I asked my grandmother who made this pottery. And then, of course, she asked me which village did I get it from, because not only is there Hawiku, but off to the east of Hawiku, from where we lived, as you climb this ridge, now you got the access to this ridge line of Ketchibao, which is about, maybe a half mile from where we live. And was our grazing area. And so sometimes I would take the sheep up towards the ridge. Sometimes I would take them down to the lower plain. But at most any given time, I would end up in these villages. And this is where my grandmother, knowing that I visit these villages often, and I pick pottery shards up there, this is where she asked, well, which village did you get this pottery shard from? And at the time I said, oh, it was from Hawiku, this is where I was at this morning or yesterday afternoon when I wore that pants. And then, of course, I told her that most of the pottery shards I dropped it off to grandma at the village. And then she goes, oh, okay. And then she goes, well, if you got it at Hawiku, this piece of shard, she said, that's probably your grandfather's ancestors, my grandfather. That would be his ancestors that would have made this pottery, because that's his origin village. And so she also said, well, if you had gotten this at the other village up on the ridge, then that would have been my ancestors that made the pottery. And so in a very early age, I was like, maybe 14 years old, 15 years old is when this was told upon me. And so I kind of knew now at this early stage that I have descendants, relations to both these villages. And so, that this kind of led to, just knowing the notion of where my family came from. So, and then later on, it helped me to understand what are these movements of conglomeration and separation by the people. This yeah, I mean, but my background coming in, from this farm, raised, on a very traditional and religious sort of platform, coming in, I got myself into school, but living out there, it kind of got, difficult, especially 70s into the 80s. These were still those early times when the community hadn't really evolved to what it is. A lot of the village here in Zuni, of course, and I think I told you before, but some of the areas in the village, some of these homes didn't really have adequate utilities. You look at this uh, poster here of the village looking from what is maybe the plaza area in the south section. Some of these, some of these homes in the 80s and 90s and the 70s, of course, still didn't have electricity or running water for that matter. And so, you know, um, coming in, this is where, um, in the 90s and 80s or 70s and 80s, this is where, of course, all of these things just kind of started to play out as coming in. They not living here, living out there where we didn't have any electricity, no running water. But I got myself through school, mainly just because of my own intentions of getting an education. My grandfather had a little bit of education. He would talk about how, the boarding school was up here in Black Rock. And of course, it wasn't eliminizing in any way. Of course, they volunteered to go to school. And so this is where, he knew a little bit of math. He was at one point, he knew, what mathematics really was, but he was the one that actually gave me the go ahead to, to become what I wanted to be, was this archaeologist. And, of course, he had talked my grandmother into, of course, now allowing me to leave home, because, well, yeah, because my grandmother was not keen on having me leave home at all. Because I was really the only real help that they had. And at the time when we lived out there, 70s and 80s, the population at one point in Ojo Caliente was in the hundreds. But by the time the 70s and 80s came in, the population had significantly dropped to about 20 people.
Wow.
And this is where we as a family still resided here. And, of course, back then, this was those times where I was the help to many people, because most of the people out there were not. Yeah, nobody under 50 resided out there. These were all elderly and elderly women. They lived out there, but it was always great because they would often get together at night. And we lived in what was designated the plaza of the village. They would sit out there, on summertime like this. It's, just like having a backyard fire and sitting around a fire pit, and they would sing and sometimes dance, but coming in, that living out there like that as an archaeologist, having now the go ahead to come in and really establish myself, you know, by what would be really the 90s after I had completed right out of high school is where, of course, things start to change for me. Archaeology becomes, in a surprising note, just an occupation that's just now spurring here in the Pueblo of Zuni. In the 70s was when this was only an intuition into preservation. But in the 80s, it flourished to now create what will be a very early Zuni archaeological program. And the 70s and late 70s. So by the time, in the 80s, this was now starting to be a thriving industry here. And not to the degree after I had gotten in, but of course, just coming in now as, after building a 30-year career, I just like to look at my background as just this individual who had the great opportunity to live almost this primitive lifestyle that some of my peers didn't get. And, before I started getting into this conversation here, I mentioned that not a lot of my peers, residing here didn't get that chance to, be out there in the fields, with as a shepherd.
Does give you a different perspective.
Yeah, and of course coming into that, having to now build this career after 30 years, I kind of still sometimes sit back and say, wow, this is something that we were a part of. The infrastructure of Zuni, this large excavation. How here in the visitor centers where we kind of even in our memories keep that as a repository for people coming in and showing information.
Once you go to the model.
Yeah. We'll go ahead and explain that. But my background is just based upon on how I was raised. I use that a lot, and that's even see, my grandmother uh, didn't have any English skills whatsoever. She was one that stuck to her roots, and she didn't want anything to do with, of course, education. And so that's why I got to. Yeah. She had her knowledge of what she needed to be and do, for survival. But of course, in a way, having her to speak this very primitive language of Zuni, that's kind of what helped me rise in the archaeological industry. Because, well, once when the preservation department was now established, this is where, an advisory team was composited, from many different societies for now recommendations on the federal and of course, preservation of law. And this is where these elderly men would be directed or coordinated by an Anglo archaeologist. And most of these elderly men, of course, spoke nothing but Zuni. And so, being this young archaeologist who knew Zuni language fluently, I was brought in as the interpreter. Yeah, we had other Zunis that worked there, but they were the more academic type. They were the ones who resided here. And, their parents were the ones that told them, go to school, go to college, do this, do that. As for me, my grandparents were like, you have to stay here, you have to be the shepherd, you're the help, you learning from us will better your future kind of thing. And so,
Pardon the fun, but were you considered the black sheep of the family?
no.
Okay.
In fact, having to be raised by my grandparents, I was actually looked at as the lucky one, because most, if not all, even my younger brothers, they all grew up here.
Yeah.
This was home to them because they're used to the TV, the electricity, you know, in the 70s and 80s, for a young kid at the time, this was a change in it. It was starting to become sort of this contemporary environment of society now.
The big city.
There was Thriftway there now, and then bikes started to become a thing in Zuni. We would have kids basically would form little sort of packs and ride their bikes around, and so things started to become fun. And then, of course, there were extracurricular activities after school, like school senior class dance on a Friday night for the senior class to raise money. Things like that started to take place. And of course, people were wanting to stick around and, starting to have fun out here. But, coming back and looking at all of that, sometimes I never made field trips or other things that, of course, some of my peers did. But
an archaeological site right here.
yeah. And
I didn't have that. You could do a dig in my backyard. And you never had anything.
Yeah, yeah,
But you really are fortunate in a way that you do have, a wondrous place to be an archaeologist. I would think.
yeah. I mean, it to me, I mean, I didn't really have to go nowhere except to Palo Alto, but that was on my terms.
Yeah.
And of course, I still commend my professor, Dr. John Rick, who is an archaeological professor from Stanford University. I think on the verge of retiring now, but of course, us archaeologists, it's always in your blood where you can't necessarily stop. But he was actually the first real individual outside of Zuni that gave me an opportunity to, and it's because of, some of the failures that I made during this time of teaching here. High school, of course, by the time I was about senior class, uh, the University of Stanford and Dr. John Rick had collaborated with the Zuni Public School District to now introduce anthropology, archaeology in a high school level in conjunction with uh, Palo Alto students. And so, in the year 1986 or 87, very early later in that year, this class had come in, and this is where, by this time I was fortunate enough to have enough credit to take these pre-college courses where they would load about 12, 15 students in a bus and drive us to Gallup, New Mexico, and to the UNM campus there, which was just now thriving as well. And we would take these college courses, and of course, after that, they would bring us home. And unlike today, where if you had enough credits, you don't have to be in school. But back then, attendance was still part of the curriculum. And so, in the afternoons when we were brought back, this is where,
That's a long commute.
yeah, and this, but, you know, 30, 45 minutes, you're being brought home from 11:30 to about 12:30 in the afternoon, at noontime. From there, of course, they had two separate lunches. Because there were so many kids. But we would come during that last lunch session. We would eat lunch and then, of course, now go to what they call the elective classes. And this is where I make the mistake of taking anthropology and archaeology, thinking it had something to do with space. Because, astronomy, I got the two words mixed up. And for me, I found it interesting because although it's kind of almost a tabooish thing, because my grandma was always superstitious about a lot of things. Every time we sat outside, I would gaze up and watch, so you would see a meteor or something from time to time. And I was always amazed by it because out there in the midst of the dark, that's the only thing you see. I mean, it's like you can reach out to the stars. Yeah. Yeah. And so, just kind of, mistakenly taking this class, uh, introduced me to what is archaeology. I took this class and, it wasn't rocket science to me. It just now said, this is a study of a prehistoric indigenous culture or native culture. And ironically, when I found this out and looked at my own, what is settings, and I said, it's kind of like looking for fire pits and remnants of villages. And I mean, I already know, yeah. And so I already knew what archaeology now meant. And, of course, my professor, Dr. John Rick, gave, class, projects. And this is where he just threw out this class project to the entire, course class and said, make a timeline or, something, that you would think that fits in archaeology. So of course I I really didn't know what I was doing, but I went and I took a piece of paneling, real thin uh, paneling board for walls that we, of course, had numerous items out at home. So I just took this little plank and then I just built him a little, adobe structure like a village. Just like a little village, and just put a ladder sticking in, all these things and set it up. And, he was looking through all this and here I come in. He thought it was a cake. I put it down and I said, no, it's a village. It's a project, I mean, if this is archaeology, you're probably looking for old settlements like this, which of course he said,
That's
okay.
what you're looking for.
Yeah. And then so that's kind of what intrigued him. And then, he then offered me this job, where he told me that, I'm going to be coming back, in the summer. And by this time, maybe you would have graduated. And, I'd be delighted if you come and help me out with this archaeological field school we're going to be doing below the mesa back here. And he goes, oh, really? He goes, yeah. And so I said, well, yeah, and then he said, if you're interested, if you can leave a good telephone number where I could reach you when I'm back. And so, I just did this just, just for whatever reason why. I didn't have no intention that this would become a sort of career in the beginning. And so that's kind of how I get into archaeology. And then, of course, ironically, after I graduated, he comes back, just about a month or so after. And this is where now in this field school, I'm here. I'm home at at Oho, and my aunt comes to the village like she always did, or still does. Come in here, she said, "Oh yeah, we got a message for you from a white guy. He caught you." And I said, "Oh really?" And, by this time, a lot had happened, and I kind of forgot. And this is where I said, "Okay, well, let's go. I'll go back with you to Zuni, and we'll make this phone call." And came back, of course, called this number that was left for me, and on the other line is John Rick, already here in Zuni. He goes, "Kenny, I'm here." And I said, "Okay, great." So that's when he more or less, "Are you still interested in coming work in this field school?" Um,
How did the archaeological dig that there's a model back here on the wall come
this one here.
about?
Oh, that's many years after the fact, in 1993, this project to enhance what is the Pueblo of Zuni, under what is the National Housing Agency, along with our Zuni Housing Agency, collaborating to now infrastructure what are these still habitated homes. But of course, this really begins in 1993. We would come in as this now investigative team of archaeologists now in homes that were, of course, families still living there. They would remove a family from their home and put them up in a housing authority unit or a home up in Black Rock. Some for, maybe almost 2 years. Because at the initial get-go of these homes, once they are listed under this list of homes that are to be renovated, you know, um, once we get in, that first, depending on how long the procedures take, maybe a good 6 months, maybe a good 8 months, we'll come in and we will go into these homes in almost the entire layout of the village. And we would put in excavation units, and at this very early stage of what is the research of Zuni now, from 1993 to about 2004, almost a decade, a little over a decade of just, infrastructure of these um, homes led us to now excavate various parts of the village. And then,
I'm sorry.
yeah, yeah,
Rita mentioned that there had been people living here And Pueblo for 12,000 years.
Thousands of years. This excavation here, of course, entailed almost at the end of what was 8 months within 2004. It would entail almost 100 feet of deposition. And, we reached about 95, 92 feet below. It was actual a 75-foot hand excavation, but it followed up by about a 25-foot auger test at the 75-foot level. But in theory, of course, that we started hitting colluvial sediments. But to my own experience, these are like riverbed soils, very thick and cobbly. But this is where, from what we also discovered, prior to this time or shortly after this excavation, was discovery of a mastodon kill site.
Really?
2 minutes south of the village. And this is where it was also, of course, portion of a mandible jaw was taken and collected, which has a molar tooth in it. It's the size of a football almost. And this is where, of course, along this discovery in a arroyo, which is south of the village here, down there in the cut, we had discovered several sort of stone materials like chert and other materials that would be utilized to, of course, create uh, projectiles and flints and other cutting material or tools. But just as we were finding these evidence of flakes of stones, we also started finding like broken projectile points, bases and tips and stuff. Until, of course, we really found a full projectile point. Now several of them just kind of just scattered. Some of them stuck still within the wall of this cut. And so having to discover this and now bringing assessors of paleontologists coming in. Of the five that we had, four of them basically confirmed that this is one of the first real mammals that would have spawned it after a Triassic era. This mastodon, any given rate, the latest that we got as a time circle was 500,000 years ago. The earliest will be 300,000. But in format to this was a human contact kill site. And so it gives us that now sort of philosophy of theory that says that we as a people had now been here even at an archaic time era where this would be that very stage where these mastodons would have existed. Anywhere from 300 to 500,000 years ago, but in our history and what we know, this also fits that our own timeline within what we know of who we are as a people, because our time of in entrance into this world, of course, was at a very late Triassic time era, and as I said, we were in reptilic form. And this, of course, was now the entrance into this fourth world, as it was designated for us. We would come in, and shortly as we now enter out of the Little Colorado River by way of the Grand Canyon, this is where Hardscrabble Wash, which is 35 miles to the west of here, is an area where this evolution of this reptilic ancestor will be now transformed into a human figure, classified under affiliation, sectioned off in migratory search parties. The winter people are known as Hopi, Laguna, Acoma, Wallapai, Havasupai, Taos, Laguna, Cochiti, Santo Domingo, all of these Pueblonian communities of the northern Colorado Plateau. And then, of course, there are those secondary brotherhoods known as the Magion, the Hohokam, the Casas Grande, San Pedro Indigenous Valley people. And even yet to this day, we still proclaim the Mayans, Aztecs, possibly the Incas as a tertiary set of brethrens. Those were the very people that were sent out to search for this prophesized area of Halona Itiwana. The Ashiwi from Hardscrabble Wash as a majority whole just simply transitioned here, 35 miles from Hardscrabble Wash to here. A slow transition. We know that this now great search for this prophesized area begins at now an archaic time era where the movement of people started to progress, which will build what is the Southwest in an ancient time, Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon. These are all established by our brethren who were sent out to search for this prophesized area. And of course, they will ultimately be the one to abandon it due to what was Zuni being founded as the center place of Mother Earth's chest. And of course, all of this really informality of what we have as a practice, still is today a standard. And of course, for the people, our arrival here, seemingly, of course, 35 miles, like going to Gallup, we will venture in here now at this archaic time where the, of course, the mesas and the higher elevated ridges would have been a prime area to monitor these herds of mastodons or maybe a small group that was migrating. We had, if you look at some of these old photos, there was a slew of small tributaries coming in, these small springs that came in. And of course, Zuni River at one point in time, if you look at it, this whole area was a floodplain.
Yeah.
And even in an archaic time era, this would have possibly been this huge river that just comes in. Zuni, at the time, its archaic early time era, would have probably been just this sort of beach soil like dune in what would have been the center of this floodplain. And our people, eventually by this time venturing in, found this high rise, this low rise in the middle of this river, of course, found this to be a well suitable place for habitation. I would like to think that there are possibly very early basket maker structures still below this what I like to call colluvial mound settlement. At this, at the end of the archaic era, these circular dwellings became what is a formidable habitation structure, dug into the ground about a human's length, 4 or 5 feet in temperature. And this will be a structure where a roof is built like a pyramid, where there will be at least 4 sides. And then there will be primary structures that will be placed on pillar walls or at the floor. Poles will come. There are several varieties of how a pit structure will be infrastructure, but the formality of it is that it's dug in the ground, circular. In this day and age of the basket maker, our people's formulation was to still kind of mimic this reptilic sort of attribute where they dug in the ground, circular in shape. The theories of as a people you bed down into this circular structure underground. Mother Earth seemingly is holding you and your family while you are sleeping. That was that whole format. Going down into the ground for whatever reason was that first form of a safe haven for the people. But then, of course, as time progressed and, maybe ingenuity theories changed to where this square structure above ground now becomes this formality of infrastructure of the village. But if you look at it, and if you look at any pueblo throughout the Southwest, and not just Zuni in itself, because we were all relatives, and brethren. which had almost the same traditional values, as we have. So villages mimic what is this formality of an anthill, where of course our village is named after this word Halonawa, which of course means that sort of this place of a red ant, where this would be the eternal habitation of stay. And of course, if you look at an ant hill, it's kind of like a pyramid. If you happen to cut it in half, you see all these different little chambers. If you cut the Pueblo village in half like that and look at the profile, you're going to find an exact match of this now, of course, infrastructure of anthill. Now you have this village with several houses on top, but as it goes down, it winds up at the bottom. So if you cut that in half, it'll mimic this outlook of an anthill. And so that's kind of how, our villages tend to be. But of course, as far as us being here in time circle, it's in the thousands, 300,000. I would take at least 300,000 as an initial step now into here.
But when y'all came in, I think you put it as fourth world, you were in a reptilian form, but then you changed into more humanoid
Yeah,
form. And just what brought that about? Why not?
Well, it's a simple concept as change, it's just similar, nothing more revolutionary about this except for that it was now time for this reptilic ancestor to be formed into what would be a suitable sort of being in what is Mother Earth and in this environment. And so, of course, we were created in this reptilic figure because our debut into the fourth world, into the daylight world, was at a reptilic time, so that we could fit the environment that came at the time of our debut, what was already here. But when the meteors had now impacted, it would change much of the environment on a global sort of network to where things would now change into the much more, of course, what has been the human factor, almost, 300,000 years ago. This is where, of course, this change comes in by, as what we know of the twilight beings, the North Star and the Morning Star. These are the two implementary figures in which, of course, are the creators of the children of Mother Earth, and then, of course, are the protectors and the evolutionists of the people. They literally come down to the surface after the impacts here and encountered this salamander children, and literally through the use of a projectile point, flint, they changed the people, this salamander, into, as I said, physically into this human form. Projectile point flint. Yeah. And so they had this tool that was this sort of implement to change this figure out of this reptilic form now into a vertical human structure. This is where this occurred at Hardscrabble Wash, 35 miles to the west of here. And this is where now that classification of people comes in, where we as the Ashi, we are created in this large assemblage, given this right to be the brothership of what is now the Puebloan community of the Southwest. We were given the heart of the earth that was taken out of the Grand Canyon, brought down all the way this far by this reptilic ancestor, now changed here at Hardscrabble and sent out to find this prophesized area so that the proper location to place this heart would now, of course, be seized out by what is the children of Mother Earth, this Pueblonian factor. They basically were sent out in this now, of course, motivational sort of effort to find this particular area that they should and would, of course, as told, make the center place of Mother Earth. But in reality, to all of this, all of that effort and all of these, the powers that be, seemingly in their own mind, already knew where the middle place was. That's why in sort of this catch-22 like orientation, we were sent directly here, but our brethren were sent out over this now, of course, as they designated uncharted, unknown territory of what they only thought was the chest of Mother Earth upon this return hundreds of years later. Back here, there was two small groups of Zuni that were taken from this large group just before the get-go of now this disbursement of people. These two groups of Ashawi would lead many great people. The map in the corner here entails that platform of where the people went, north, south, east, and of course, majority of us came from the west, from out of the Grand Canyon. And so this is where the arrows that you see coming back sort of towards the center of the page where Halona Itiwana is designated, these two groups eventually will come back. And what we have now uh, through sort of designations of archaeology configuration know that this took place about the first millennium. This return of the people coming in at the first millennium of the ADs brought this now, of course, theory of failure, where after returning from what is this sort of migratory search, hundreds of years later, as a failure, of course, would drive the people back to here. And once they would return, this is where those very twilights came back to the surface, but to this village of Hawiku just behind me, the portrait. What was now this western platform, anywhere from Hardscrabble washed into Zuni, especially right near the Arizona-New Mexico state line, is what we designate as the Barth Wells Badger Springs Great House Complex. These villages are sporadic villages, hundreds of them, in which we knew at the very early times of now transitioning in. We at Hardscrabble Wash at the time of affiliation were also given clans, but the clans resided within themselves. They weren't spread out like it is today. So you had one clan here, it's kind of like this table, and one clan here, one clan there, one. So this creates this huge network of small, sporadic villages, just one adjacent to another off to the west. These are very early ancient times from possibly what was an archaic Neolithic time era transitioning into what is known as the basket maker period. And then it would transition into what would be the ADs, which is now a very early Pueblonian time era where the transition out of these circular dwellings of course, now are attributed over with these square rooms. But right within this first uh, maybe 500 years of the ADs, you know, once, of course, this sort of now settlement of the people now closer to this area, this will be the time when the religion may have not been practiced by the people, as I said, in the mission. That's where, of course, this was still that trying time of search. People were starting to come in, but now, after this first millennium, this is where this return of the people now, of course, gave this discretion of what are we to do now. It will be the twilights that come back here with their formality of telling the people, well, don't worry about not finding this prophesied middle area. You know, in a sort of whispering voice to where nobody else would hear. They say, we knew where it was already, you know, all along, you know. But, of course,
Can I ask you a question?
sure, yeah.
You know, you and I have talked about the Kivas, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you know that, as you said, they're square now.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a kiva.
Well, actually, those would transition into a kiva shortly after this rollover from this basket maker or period.
Yeah.
And then once our now formalities to build from the surface up became, this is where those dwellings now, of course, I said, the abandonment of these pit structures doesn't occur. Of course, the living formality of the structure is abandoned.
Yeah.
But in what we know, this is about AD 500 transitioning into the first millennium. This would have still been partially used as maybe a habitation. But of course, when the religion was handed down and the practice of what is this format of our religion was now handed down to the people, those very pit structures become now a sort of isolated structure below this village that is now utilized for the practice of religion. And so if you, yeah, so, you know, from the basket maker time era to about AD 500, these would have, in some cases, especially in the basket maker era, would have been predominantly habitation.
Huh.
But once the ADs come in, of course, by AD 500, when the portrayment of religion was now given to the people for them to practice on the behalf of the deity gods, those facilities will become those private sort of sectors below some of these villages.
Okay.
And so they would not be abandoned, you know,
Yeah.
but they will only transform into these now underground basement-like structures where the practice of religion will take. And then, of course, this will be that formality for hundreds of years. You know, the square kiva comes in, I'd like to say, maybe 200 years ago. It's,
And excuse me.
yeah, not a problem.
I'm known for interrupting. You can ask my wife.
We could ask me.
Or me, either one. But at what point, now, is this at the time that the Katrina structure come?
Yeah, this, well, you know, from the get-go, like maybe, from the arcade into the basket maker time era, just Pueblonian time era, is when we know that the spirits of these gods used to come on their own, for their own formality of whatever. But it was always had to, you know, be towards precipitation and other things of value, longevity, prosperity. These were, although they looked ferocious looking, it was still some of the factor that they presented some kind of blessing.
And I know we talked about this Tuesday, but you know, for this meeting, I want to emphasize that these were real physical beings that were coming in.
Well, you know, yeah, in terms of course, who they were, you could almost say they were, you know, like physically present as almost as flesh and bones. But of course, they were still looked at as these spiritual figures. And these figures, of course, when you're in this form, there was no food value there, you know, as a sort of a gift of appreciation. You know,
Right.
people come in
So
and
you
they say,
wouldn't offer food.
yeah. So, but of course, you know, they thrive on the lives of the people. And that's where, of course, in their own terms, as they came to these villages, not only here in Zuni, but throughout the great Southwest. And as I said, they used to call this the great visit to the children. They would come to Zuni, Hopi, Laguna, Acoma, Cochiti. But they basically, every village they would enter, there was a joyous section, and then there was a feared section because, as said, as spirits they came in, you know, they thrived on the lives of the people. Every time they came in, for the young folks and those that were healthy, more or less, the actual encounterment with these spirits gave you those blessings of longevity, prosperity. And so if you were elderly, health weary, or just unknowing about your own life's perceptions, that you might become an offering to the gods. And so every time they came and danced, they left, somebody would, in the village would often pass on. And that's where, of course, the spirits in themselves, these deities of gods, basically on their own self-conclusion, now came to this point where they said, if we keep coming and taking the lives of our children, although when they bring these blessings, but of course, taking lives, eventually we may not have children in the future to come visit. And this we know may have taken place, this hand down of religion by the spirits themselves to the people may have been about in the AD 500 era, where after 500 years, maybe even more, because of course the basket maker era was already a time of, settlement in maybe in pit structures like this, maybe a clan will come in and settle here, and maybe 3 or 4 of these pit structures in an area for about a year, maybe 2 years. And this, of course, at the time, hunting and gathering was still pretty much that formality. A little bit of cultivation may have been known, but this was a time when these spirits used to come very early. So of course, the hand down of it, we kind of not speculate at AD 500, but the involvement and the association between the two factors may have gone for thousands of years. That is why we don't have a timeline of when we really have. Yeah, but what is also understood that from what is the core center of the earth, when the people were established, and of course all these implements made, this is where the people, in some degree, were placed in these shamanistic roles of medicine societies. There had already been established a little portion of this hierarchy, which begins with sort of these rain priest delegates and what is the medicine societies. They were already, to some degree, established at the time of creation. They were the ones that were the more influential in the belief of a higher power other than their own lives. And so that's sort of that now beginning cycle that once they make it as these people and they come to these now worlds and of course this daylight world, there would and should be a form of belief of religion. And so it basically begins here. It will only take years and years, of course, for these creations of the gods come in. That part, to do sense, is esoteric. But I can only share to you this, that the creation of the gods began at St. John's, Arizona, just before the impacts of meteors that would pick up the dinosaur era. Because it is there where a magnitude of life was lost by what is the Little Colorado River. This reptilic ancestor, by way of the Grand Canyon, had now reached St. John's area just before this time when the meteors would impact. At the brink of a dinosaur era is when this arrival of this salamander comes this far. But it is also a time when the leader, the head cacique, kind of now formulated that they coming out of the western side of the Little Colorado River was the wrong side. He said that it's more or less if we cross the river to the eastern bank, we will be on the proper side in which this doorway into Mother Earth's chest that was designated is placed. So this is where the attempt of the people in this salamander figure cross the Little Colorado River. But the river would claim the lives of many, many ages. And this was a sort of purgatorish time where there was no heaven or no hell. So when one salamander ancestor would have perished, there would only be a transition from their salamander state as people perished and fell closer into the floor of this little Colorado River. Their reptilic state would transition to frogs, turtles, water snakes, other aquatic underlife species. They would wait here until what are the forms of the buttes of heaven are created. This part is esoteric because this is the beginning and the creation of our heaven on earth, which is the beginning of a religiously practiced cycle. It will be from here that the introduction of the deity gods will later come in. But upon the creation of it, this is the esoteric part of this religion. The creations of gods cannot be told about how exactly they came to be, because it's basically describing the beginnings of a religion that should be esoteric. If you do not belong to a peoples that is designated under this religion, it is a tabooish formality where you will basically endure the adversities of life. And of course, for some, it could lead to death. This is where, that is why, of course, in due sense, a lot of the religious practices that we still conduct are in a private note primarily during preparation. During these preparation times, in the summertime, in the summer solstice, in the wee hours of the night, there are groups of the Kiva societies gathering in their Kivas to practice songs. Although you can hear the singing inside this Kiva, you cannot go in. Nobody can. There are times like later on in this month or maybe next month. See, we only borrow this religion, although we portray it and practice it, but under special constables and prayers is what gives us the right to portray and practice.
It says the religion was given by the Katrina, so I can understand
Yeah,
the idea that you want to borrow.
yeah, because the understanding between the spirit and the people was to minimize the loss of the people, of not losing their lives. And so the gods gave what on their behalf is their religion so that the people can practice it. They would portray these deity gods. They would make them on their own, but of course, it's only a borrowship for a certain time. These ceremonies that we have, when I go, I step into this role of portrayment, and then these Kiva societies, they have regular jobs already. They subtract from there to go portray this religion for as many hours as it takes to complete a session. After that, they go back to who they are as human people. But once the ceremony is really complete and it should now come to an end, this is where prayers, these take hours, where these prayers are spoken to give thanks to the gods for this group or this people or this person, to portray this deity god on their behalf. But it also mentions that they are giving them back for the time being until maybe next year. Yeah. And so through special prayers, and then of course these are followed up by fasting by some of the leaders. So there is a price that's paid, and then a purification sometimes with some of these groups during these dances is where, of course, when things don't go right, there are these purifications, and of course, again, like how the gods are created, this is an esoteric form to where if there should be some sort of adverse event during this event, at any given time, the purification to the society comes in, and this is not a welcoming sight. There is a bit of course, what would be a physical sort of justification, and this is that esoteric part. And
Can I ask you?
once these prayers are then said, of course, there's now this sort of stretch of a body where this is finally over. Now we don't have to portray this religion until next year.
Interesting.
Yeah. We don't do this just because we say it was given to us. We do it because we can keep the legacies of these spirits alive for eternity. Is what that stipulation and promise was made millions of years ago.
Let me ask you. I wanted to ask a question. Jim asked this question, and I have no idea. Do you, with the Kachinas themselves, do individuals pray to individual Kachinas?
No.
How do you?
Well, are you talking about the Kachina dolls or the Kachina
Well,
itself?
I know if you want help, do you pray to a Kachina as an individual, to one of the real ones?
But yeah, I mean, it's a multitude of factors. It's not just the gods themselves, also your loved ones who have passed on. Like, right, when I ask for help and blessing, I'm more or less related to my grandparents.
Sure.
And so, although they have left, this earth now for several decades, um, our conversations still are very much alive, even though, uh, I can't hear them, but I know they can hear me. They know I can't hear them, but they understand that I can feel and hear what they are trying to express to me by any means that they know how. And this is where, my brother of this lieutenant society who had also passed on was an elderly man. And, one day, he was talking to his wood axe that had broke. And, he was, uh, at another house and bringing this broken axe down. And he was kind of, like a person scolding, you piece of, and then, one day I asked him, I saw you, like a crazy man talking to me. And then you think I'm crazy, huh? And he goes, yeah. And he goes, well, after what I'm about to tell you, you're going to feel like you're crazy too, because you're going to understand why. I said, okay. And then he said, uh, more or less, everything on this earth is alive, whether it doesn't move or not. But with whatever it is alive. So you talk to these things. You may be crazy because if, you start your car before you go in. Come on, baby. Or, you want to, you have to talk to these things because,
They're alive and have a conscience.
yeah, it's crazy as it seems is where he said. It's not a crazy assumption because at one point you're going to need this tool, and this tool is going to help you to achieve something. And so, in a way, even though it doesn't talk, it's useful to you. So you have to communicate with it. And that's kind of that sort of way.
Swings back around to what Reed was talking about, a question I had asked him, whether individuals, now I understand what you said, I believe, because I deal with my ancestors as well.
Yeah.
And they deal with me.
Yeah.
But now, do people also pray to Kachina individually?
Yeah.
Would they pray looking at one of the dolls? Is there's a consciousness about the doll that's connected to the Kachina that represents?
Well, yeah. Well, the doll and so okay. Let's go back here. Groups and societies will pray to a certain type of deity god. There's the Shalako, there's the Mudheads, there's an array of deity gods in which one can pertain to this particular Kachina or whatever, because those are, he would call them his father. And, under the portrayment of these religion, these deity gods, this is part of that scenario of portrayment where you will have to pray to this certain deity god that you are portraying. Because,
of course.
because you are portraying this spirit. And so you have to have that continuity between the two must communicate. And this is a factor. This always, and with anything that we do as a tribe and as a people, before we do things, there is that certain prayer that takes place. But there are certain levels. One person can pertain to a deity god, or like myself, I don't just pertain to Ashalako or the fire god. I include them all. This is where Father, Son, Mother Earth, the ancient creator of life, and then of course your ancestors, and then these gods, and as a whole, you name them as the society, our fathers, that of course are the deity gods. And then, the rest is followed by birds, animals, geological locations, and other things. And so it's not just one particular format where one can focus their prayers on. And in the Zuni religion, this is where all of those factors are in prayers. It's not one single factor. It's an array, a multitude of formalities that bring, of course, these blessings upon the request of the people.
Like me, you need all of them.
Yeah. And well, for the Kachina doll, there is a difference between how we view these implements versus like our brethren of Hopi. Um, they're more influential in creating these figures of Kachina dolls. Their philosophy, of course, this I got when I was working with the preservation office. We had a collaboration with the Hopi Preservation Department. We would uh, meet our advisories together, these two factions, and they would talk about this religion and familiarness of things. And at one time, this question actually came up by the National Park Service, where this topic of religion came in, and because some of our advisory team of Zuni oppose the production of Kachina dolls.
Right.
And this is where Hopi has stated that we make these dolls to give our children this right of this religion, so that they can never lose the heritage of it. While Zuni goes, well, Kachina dolls are only made to create life. And it would always be, of course, later on as this doll is created. These dolls were created for couples who could not conceive a child. This doll would actually represent what is a life that would later be conceived as this doll is created and given to this struggling couple. And it will be made by what are the Mudhead societies. Because the Mudhead societies, of course, again, an esoteric, very esoteric society. But in just what is this terms of who they are spiritual figures that can never die.
Right.
And that is why they have this blessing of longevity. But they also are the creators of a sort of life that cannot basically spawn. And so when struggling couples who are wanting to have children without conceivement, of course, the process is that either the husband, the partner, a father, an uncle, a brother, any portion of this couple's family, a male portion, will be sent to a Mudhead Society house. And this is where the request of a doll will be, of course, placed upon one of these members of the group. And, of course, this individual who portrays this Mudhead will sometimes ask if there's a particular, deity that they want as this doll. Some do request certain types of dolls, but many would say just they will give this creator of this doll this open sort of mind of what he will come up to create. And so, but a doll will be made, and then under the portrayment during these ceremonies, this mudhead now portrayer will take this doll to the plaza. The couple or the lady who's having trouble conceiving is told to go to the plaza. And as this mudhead now brings this doll, and he would tend to it as if it was a child at the time of the ceremony during the dances and songs. He'll take this doll and it's kind of as a lullaby. And then, of course, during the intermission of the ceremony, this portrayer of a mudhead will come in and find this couple or this lady. They will be, of course, and then through prayer, this doll will be handed to this lady. And of course, through the prayers, this is said that this doll will represent the life you are wanting to have. And this is where, of course, she is told you must stay until the ceremony is over. And you will go to your home and you'll place this doll over what will be the area you bed down. And will hopefully will be the chance that will be given to you to now spawn a child. And so, of course, this lady will do what this mudhead told her to do. Eventually, if things go well, she would now conceive a child. But in reality to this doll now, of course, on the wall, as the child is born and grows up, this doll, if nobody plays with it or anything, just there, will deteriorate on its own. For whatever reason, an arm, a headdress, whatever, will start to fall off. It'll start to deteriorate. This is a time when males of that, maybe the father to this child, will take now this Kachina doll. That was the very reason why he has a child. Well, with offerings of food, cornmeal, and turquoise, take this doll to the river and place it in the ground. And of course, now send this doll to the heavens. One day, as of course in life cycle, these two lives will come together. And that is the format of how Kachina dolls were made or are supposed to be made. But of course, in these days, a lot of these creations of dolls are now towards what is the production of revenue. And this is really where that whole proportion of Kachina dolls are basically made, put out as art. But of course, in reality, to these creations, in the Zuni philosophy of life, these are the representatives of lives that could not be without the help of these dolls. And so, yeah, that really is that fine line in what we had. But in these days, that sort of now tradition can be overlooked. And,
but it's still there.
it's still there, I mean,
This has been great.
yeah.
There's a, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this